So if you think about the structure of acids and bases, you can get a lot of insight into the strength of that acid or the base. If you look at this first equation, we have HCl, which is obviously a strong acid, fully ionizing, hence why there's a one-direction arrow here, into hydronium and the chloride conjugate base for this. So this conjugate base of this strong acid, if you think about what that means, obviously the strong acid is an acid because it's capable of giving up that proton. Well, in the reverse reaction, this Cl minus, this chloride ion, would be capable of regaining a proton to go back to the HCl. But it doesn't, and that's made clear by this one-directional arrow here. Since this arrow indicates that this reaction is only progressing in this direction, this conjugate base here, even though it's technically labeled as a conjugate base, must not want to reprotonate or gain that hydrogen back very easily, or else we would see some of this exchange happening in both directions, which would completely eliminate the HCl as a strong acid, because a strong acid will completely ionize. Whereas if you think down here, we have HA, which is just some generic weak acid. Since this is at equilibrium, this conjugate base must be accepting of enough of protons that some of them do reaccept the protons and turn back into the weak acid. And that's the whole idea of equilibrium. So what's the difference between this conjugate base here? Why does it accept protons back, whereas this conjugate base doesn't seem to reaccept those protons? Well, this stems from the fact that the stronger an acid, the weaker that conjugate base is, the less able that base is to reaccept a proton that was donated. That has to do with the stability of the anion that's produced. So these weaker conjugate bases are actually more stable from a chemical standpoint. So if we go back, this chloride ion is more stable as a chloride ion than whatever this anion is all by itself. Since this HCl is more stable, it doesn't really have a desire to regain that proton. However, this anion down here is unstable enough that some of them will regain their protons. So we just have to consider that these are all connected. The strength of an acid, the stronger the acid, the weaker the conjugate base, but the weaker that conjugate base, the more stable that conjugate was. So an increased stability is going to result in a stronger, this is an increased stability of the conjugate, my apologies. An increased stability of the conjugate is going to result in a stronger acid or base. This is true in both directions. The more stable that conjugate, the stronger the acid or the base was. So we need to think about why this might be, and to help us, we're going to define oxyacids, which are just acids that contain an oxygen. So here are four similar oxyacids. We have HClO, HClO2, HClO3, and HClO4. Well, generally speaking, more oxygens will yield a more stable conjugate. And that more stable conjugate means that you're going to have a stronger acid. So simply by looking at these four acids here, we can tell which of these is going to be the strongest acid. It's going to be the one with more oxygens. And you could have already looked at this and known that because HClO4 is one of our strong acids. The weakest of these acids will be the HClO, as it only has one oxygen. Well, goodness, if you think about why, think about what the anion formed here will be when this hydrogen detaches. You have a ClO minus ion. Here, when that hydrogen detaches, it's a ClO2 minus ion. Here it's a ClO3 minus, and here it's a ClO4 minus. So think about where this negative charge on each of these is coming from. It's coming from the electron that was poached off of each of the hydrogens, turning them into protons. Well, that extra electron has to have somewhere to go, and if it stays in one spot too long, that might lead to an instability of the ion. So if you think about this ClO4, this isn't quite exactly the right Lewis structure, but the idea of why it works is good enough to think about. This this Cl is surrounded by 4 oxygens, which are more electronegative than this chlorine. So these electrons, or this extra electron, is going to spend more time on oxygen. But within this ClO4, there's 4 different options as to where that electron can spend its time. By having more oxygens, it's better able to spread this electron around the conjugate that was formed, and that leads to an increased stability. Now, you don't really need to fully understand that for AP chemistry, but you do need to understand that more oxygens results in a stronger acid, but it does have to do with the ability to spread that charge around amongst more of those oxygen atoms. Another effect that can lead to the acid being strong or weak is electronegativity. So our general rule here is that an increased electronegativity in a conjugate will yield a stronger acid or base, whatever you're talking about. But it's easier to think about acids in this case. If you had HClO versus HBrO versus HIO. They have the same number of oxygens. They obviously all have a hydrogen. So if we wanted to inquire as to the strength of these acids, we would need to think about the electronegativity of the different element, which in this case is chlorine, bromine, or iodine. Well, if we think about what the effects of these electronegativities are, out of these, chlorine is the most electronegative. So if we think about how this is attached to this ClO, and again, this isn't quite exactly the Lewis structure, obviously, but I want to talk about these shared electrons here. In theory, those electrons should be shared equally, but we know that's not the case when there's a difference in electronegativity. And since chlorine has the highest electronegativity out of all of this, we can actually better visualize this by saying these electrons are going to spend more time closer to this chlorine and this oxygen. They're going to spend more time closer to the anion. If we thought about this for HBrO, bromine is a little bit less electronegative than chlorine, so these electrons will not be quite as close to the anion, but they'll be they'll be a little bit closer to the hydrogen, not as close to the anion. If you think about HIO, in this case, they're even less of a difference of electronegativity. So these electrons will truly be more balanced between the proton and the anion. Well, then think about which one of these hydrogens here is the easiest to remove from this compound. Well, since these electrons are spending so much time away from this hydrogen anyway, this is effectively just a proton, meaning it's going to be the easiest to protonate, to lose that proton. So what happens here is this increased electronegativity within this conjugate stabilizes that conjugate, which leads to HClO being the strongest of these acids. So again, one more time, as the electronegativity increases within that conjugate, you should expect there to be a stronger acid present. And again, you don't really have to explain this to a deep, deep level, but you do need to know this relationship between these two. While we're talking about the structure of specific acids and bases, though, I do want to talk about carboxylic acids. And a carboxylic acid, let me clean this up a little bit, simply contains, I said I was cleaning it up, now I'm making a mess here. They contain a COO group. This is called a carboxyl group. You don't need to know that, but it's part of organic chemistry. It's just good to know. You do need to recognize, though, that when you have a COOH on a compound, that is going to produce an acid. Let's think about why. We'll think about vinegar, which is also called acetic acid. Sometimes you'll see the formula for vinegar written as CH3COOH. You might ask, well, why didn't they put these C's together or these O's together, these H's together? That's there to help you see the structure of this molecule. You have a carbon connected to 3 hydrogens. Connected to a carbon. And now this carbon is jointly connected to the other 3 remaining elements by means of a double bond to one oxygen, a single bond to an oxygen, and then that oxygen is attached to a hydrogen. This group right here, this COOH group, is the carboxyl group that I'm referencing, and this is a carboxylic acid. Why that's important is you need to register that this hydrogen is involved in the making of this acid. Again, these electrons here aren't being shared very equally. They're spending a greater portion of time near this more electronegative oxygen. So this hydrogen is being held on quite weakly. Since it's being held on weakly, it's rather free to detach, and it just protonated. So through all of this, I just need you to recognize that when you see a carboxylic acid, which is containing the COOH group, I just need you to confirm that that is an acid. And since it's not one of our strong ones, it must be a weak acid. And the last part of this is kind of hard to generalize, but a nitrogenous base is just a base that contains nitrogen. This is extremely common because if you think about how nitrogen bonds with other nonmetals, nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. So pretty routinely, you'll see something attached here or here or here, or some combination of these. Maybe only 2 of them are attached to a hydrogen or to a carbon or something. But what's important to think about is these 2 unpaired or unshared pairs of electrons on this nitrogen. There's going to be quite an area of negative charge on the top of this nitrogen. So whenever a proton, a hydrogen ion, is encountered here, we know this positive proton is going to be attracted to these negative unshared electrons. So what winds up happening is that nitrogen routinely will accept these protons. So this is too loaded to really go deeply into, but I just need you to register for this class. It's very, very common to see nitrogen-containing compounds acting as bases.